The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mining town of Globe, where weathered wooden buildings clung precariously to the rocky slopes of the Pinal Mountains. Ethan Mitchell stood at the window of his second-floor office above the Lucky Strike Saloon, watching dust devils dance between the scattered mining shacks and equipment yards that dotted the rugged landscape. As leader of the notorious Mitchell gang, he'd chosen this bustling copper mining hub as their base of operations, hiding in plain sight among the steady stream of prospectors and drifters that passed through. The sound of spurs jangling on wooden stairs drew his attention from the window. Benjamin Turner, his trusted lieutenant since their first bank robbery in Prescott 5 years ago, appeared in the doorway. The tall, broad-shouldered man's expression was grim beneath his wide-brimmed black hat. "Boss, we got trouble brewing. Jacob Roberts is running his mouth down at the saloon again, talking about splitting off and heading to Yuma. Says there's bigger scores to be had down there." Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his dark hair, still damp with sweat from the Arizona heat. The gang had been getting restless lately, and he knew why. It had been 3 months since their last major heist, the longest they'd ever gone between jobs. But things had changed for him since Anna Phillips arrived in Globe to take over the old Thompson place on the edge of town, turning it into an orphanage for the children of miners lost in cave-ins and accidents. The memory of their first meeting flooded back, her standing fearlessly in front of him when he'd come to collect protection money from the orphanage. Those clear green eyes meeting his without flinching, as she told him she knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. But instead of threatening him, she'd invited him to stay for dinner and meet the children. That night had changed everything, showing him a different kind of life he'd never thought possible for someone with his past. Benjamin cleared his throat, pulling Ethan back to the present moment. "There's something else. Word is Alexander Perez and his crew from Flagstaff are moving into the territory. Could be looking to muscle in on our operations here." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "The boys are saying maybe it's time we showed everyone we're still a force to be reckoned with. Hit the mining company payroll office, maybe. Make a statement." Ethan turned back to the window, his jaw tightening as he spotted Anna crossing the dusty street below, leading a line of children like ducklings to the general store. She'd told him about her own past, how she'd worked in a brothel in Prescott before a kindly widow helped her start a new life. Now she was doing the same for others, giving second chances to those society had cast aside. The irony wasn't lost on him that she was offering redemption while he continued leading men down a path of destruction. "Tell Jacob and the others I'll have a plan for them by week's end," Ethan said finally, his voice firm but distant. "And send Noah Phillips up here. I need to talk to him about keeping watch on his sister's place." Benjamin nodded and left, his footsteps fading down the stairs. Ethan knew Noah was torn between loyalty to the gang and protecting his sister Anna, just as Ethan himself was increasingly torn between the life he'd built and the life he found himself longing for. The gang had started years ago as a way for Ethan to reclaim his family's honor after his father died in disgrace, accused of stealing from the very mining company he'd worked for faithfully for 20 years. Back then, targeting mining operations and banks had felt like justice. Now, watching Anna shepherd her charges into the general store, he wondered if there might be better ways to honor his father's memory than violence and theft. A commotion erupted in the street as several miners burst out of the Lucky Strike, Jacob Roberts among them. Even from above, Ethan could see the younger man was drunk and spoiling for a fight. He watched as Noah Phillips intercepted Jacob, speaking in low tones and steering him away from the street where Anna and the children were emerging from the store. The scene crystallized everything that was fracturing within the gang. The old guard like Noah, who understood loyalty and family, versus hotheads like Jacob, who only cared about the next score. The sound of small boots on the wooden walkway below drew his attention back to Anna and her charges. One of the younger girls, barely more than 6, looked up and spotted him in the window. Instead of shrinking away in fear like most townspeople did, she smiled and waved. Before he could stop himself, Ethan found himself waving back. Anna looked up then, her eyes meeting his with that same unflinching gaze that had first captured his attention. In that moment, he knew changes were coming, whether his men were ready for them or not. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Prescott's main street as Ethan descended the creaking stairs of the hotel. His mind wrestled with the scene he'd witnessed, but duty called. He had a meeting with Benjamin about their next job, a silver shipment coming down from the mountain mines. Yet something felt different now. the familiar thrill of planning a heist dulled by thoughts of Anna and those children who seemed to see past his hardened exterior. Noah Phillips was waiting for him in the alley behind the livery stable, his weathered face grave. "Jacob's getting worse, boss. Found him trying to convince Alexander to raid the mining payroll office today. In broad daylight, if you can believe it. Boy's gonna get himself killed or bring the law down on all our heads." The older man scratched his gray-streaked beard, eyes reflecting decades of outlaw wisdom. "Maybe it's time we considered a different path." The suggestion hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Ethan knew Noah had been putting money aside, dreaming of buying a small ranch outside Globe. He wasn't the only one. Francis and Clara, the gang's scouts, had been talking about opening a dress shop in Flagstaff. The wild days were ending, civilization creeping in like morning fog through mountain valleys. Inside the stable, Ethan's horse nickered softly as he approached. The animal's dark eyes seemed to hold the same questioning look he'd seen in Anna's gaze. He'd built this gang on loyalty and family, not just greed. They'd survived by being smarter than the average bandits, by having a code. But codes could change, couldn't they? Evolution wasn't just for the respectable folk. The sound of raised voices drew him back to the alley. Alexander and Jacob were squared off, tension crackling between them like heat lightning. "You're soft, old man," Jacob sneered, whiskey slurring his words. "Rather play nursemaid to some whore's orphans than ride with real men." Alexander's hand drifted toward his gun, but Ethan's sharp whistle froze them both. "That's enough," he commanded, voice cutting through the tension. "Jacob, you're confined to camp until you dry out. Alexander, get him out of town before he draws attention." The younger man's face darkened with rebellion, but he knew better than to challenge Ethan directly. As they rode out, Ethan caught Noah's approving nod. The old guard understood. Discipline kept them alive. Later, as dusk painted the mountains purple, Ethan found himself walking past the orphanage on the outskirts of town. The building was modest but well-maintained, flowers blooming in window boxes despite the harsh climate. Through the front window, he could see Anna reading to a group of children, including little Alice who had waved to him earlier. The scene stirred something in him he thought had died years ago in the chaos of the war. Helen, Anna's assistant and closest friend, was sweeping the porch. She paused when she saw him, broom held like a weapon. But there was more curiosity than fear in her stance. "She's doing good work here," Ethan said quietly, surprising himself. Helen studied him for a long moment before nodding. She sees the good in people, even when they can't see it themselves. The words felt like both blessing and challenge. The walk back to his hotel room gave Ethan time to think. The gang's next big score could set them all up for new lives, if they played it smart and survived. But first, he needed to deal with Jacob and any others who might resist change. The thought of violence didn't please him like it used to. Maybe that was growth, or maybe it was just weariness. Either way, decisions would have to be made soon, before circumstances forced his hand. As night settled over Prescott, Ethan sat at his window again, watching the town settle into evening routines. A different future was possible. He could see it now, like a trail leading through dangerous country to somewhere better. The question was, could he lead his people there without losing everything they'd built together? The answer lay somewhere between who he had been and who he might become, between the man who led outlaws and the one who waved back at orphaned children. The morning brought a different kind of tension to Prescott as Ethan made his way through the bustling mining town. Word had spread about a new silver strike in the mountains, and prospectors filled the streets with their excited chatter. But his mind was on the letter he'd received from Benjamin, his most loyal gang member who'd been scouting their next target near Globe. The news wasn't good. The mining payroll they'd planned to hit was now heavily guarded, with Pinkerton agents reportedly in the mix. Frances caught his eye as he passed the orphanage, her gentle smile a stark contrast to the turmoil in his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, helping a young boy with a scraped knee while other children played in the yard. The scene struck him as both foreign and familiar, like a life he might have known in another time. He tipped his hat, but didn't stop, knowing Jacob was waiting at the saloon with questions that needed answering. Inside the dim establishment, Jacob sat with Noah, both men nursing drinks despite the early hour. Their conversation died as Ethan approached, the air thick with unspoken accusations. The setting sun cast long shadows across the mining town of Globe, as Ethan Mitchell watched his gang unload their latest haul from the Wells Fargo coach. His second-in-command, Benjamin Turner, counted stacks of gold certificates while the rest of the men celebrated with whiskey. But Ethan's thoughts kept drifting to the orphanage on the outskirts of town, where Clara Phillips had taken in another abandoned child just that morning. For 3 months now, Ethan had been making excuses to ride past the whitewashed building, watching Clara tend her garden while the children played. Sometimes she'd wave, and he'd tip his hat, trying to ignore how his heart raced. She knew who he was. Everyone in Globe did. But she never showed fear or judgment. Just that gentle smile that made him question everything about his life of crime. "Boss, we got trouble," Jacob Roberts announced, interrupting Ethan's reverie. "Alexander Perez and his crew from Prescott are moving into our territory. They hit the silver shipment we were planning to take next week." The news should have angered Ethan more than it did, but lately the thrill of the outlaw life had begun to fade, replaced by thoughts of redemption and a different kind of future. That evening, Ethan rode to the orphanage alone, ostensibly to warn Clara about Perez's gang. He found her on the front porch, mending clothes by lamplight. "Miss Phillips," he said, removing his hat, "might I have a word?" She looked up, those clear eyes meeting his, and nodded. For the first time in years, Ethan Mitchell felt like a boy again, nervous and unsure. "I appreciate the warning, Mr. Mitchell," Clara said, after he explained about Perez, "but I suspect that's not the only reason you came." She set aside her sewing and studied him. "I've seen you riding past. I've seen how you look at these children when you think no one's watching." Her words struck him like physical blows, laying bare truths he'd been avoiding. Meanwhile, back at the gang's hideout in the mountains, Benjamin Turner was having his own crisis of conscience. He'd followed Ethan for years, trusted him like a brother, but he'd seen the changes in his leader, seen how this woman was affecting him. Some of the men were getting restless, particularly Noah Phillips, no relation to Clara, who'd always been the most violent among them. The next morning brought Helen Turner, Benjamin's wife, riding hard into camp with news from town. She worked as a seamstress alongside Frances Roberts, Jacob's sister, and had overheard disturbing information. "Alexander Perez isn't just after territory," she reported breathlessly. "He's looking to make a name for himself by taking down the Mitchell gang. And he knows about Clara." Ethan's blood ran cold at the news. He'd put Clara in danger simply by showing interest in her. But when he rode to warn her again, he found her calmly teaching arithmetic to the children, including a new arrival, a girl named Alice who bore a striking resemblance to someone from Ethan's past. The child looked up, and he recognized his own mother's eyes staring back at him. Clara explained later that Alice was his sister's daughter, the sister he'd thought died in Flagstaff years ago. She'd passed through Globe last week, ill with fever, and made Clara promise to keep Alice safe. The revelation shook Ethan to his core. He had family he didn't know about, a niece who needed protection, and suddenly his outlaw life seemed not just empty but actively harmful to those he should be protecting. But walking away from the life wouldn't be simple. Noah Phillips made that clear when he confronted Ethan that night. "You're going soft," he snarled. "Perez is coming for us. And you're making eyes at some reformed whore and her collection of strays." The words were barely out of his mouth before Ethan's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling. The other men watched in tense silence. Benjamin Turner stepped between them before the fight could escalate. "We need to think this through," he said. "Perez is the real threat here, and maybe—" He glanced at his wife Helen, who'd been talking about settling down herself. "Maybe it's time for some of us to consider a different path." The gang was splitting into factions before Ethan's eyes, those who wanted change and those who clung to the old ways. The discovery of silver in the mountains above Globe had brought more than just miners to the area. It had brought families seeking new beginnings, people looking to build something lasting. Clara's orphanage was proof that even those with troubled pasts could find redemption. Ethan found himself studying the mining claims office, wondering if there might be a legitimate future there for men who knew the mountains as well as he and his gang did. As tension mounted in the camp, Frances Roberts approached Ethan privately. "Jacob's been talking about homesteading," she confided. "There's good land north of here, but Noah and his friends, they're planning something dangerous, something that involves the orphanage." The warning sent chills down Ethan's spine. He had to make a choice, and soon, before everything he was growing to care about went up in flames. Ethan spent a sleepless night in his cabin, watching moonlight paint silver shadows across the weathered floorboards. Francis's warning about Noah's plans echoed in his mind, mixing with memories of Clara's gentle smile and the children's laughter at the orphanage. By dawn, he had formulated a plan that might save both his people and the new life taking root in Globe. But it would require careful timing and trust from those who had followed him through years of outlawry. The next morning, he gathered Jacob and Benjamin at the old mineshaft entrance, away from prying ears. The early sun cast long shadows through the ponderosa pines as Ethan laid out his proposition. "The Silver Claims office is understaffed," he explained, spreading a map across a fallen log. "They need experienced men who know these mountains. We could register as legitimate scouts, help stake proper claims. No more stealing. We'd be protecting the miners from claim jumpers instead." Jacob's weather-worn face creased with interest, but Benjamin remained skeptical. "Noah's got at least 5 men solid behind him," the younger man warned, nervously adjusting his gun belt. "They won't take kindly to us going straight, especially if it means working with the same folk we've been robbing." The morning breeze carried the distant sound of pickaxes from the active mines, a reminder of the honest work that now tempted them. Meanwhile, Clara faced her own battles at the orphanage. More children had arrived with the latest wagon train from Prescott, their parents lost to fever or mining accidents. Helen and Alice helped her manage the growing numbers, but supplies were running low. The town's charity only stretched so far, and Clara knew some still whispered about her past. When Alexander, one of Noah's most loyal men, began lingering near the orphanage with suspicious frequency, Clara recognized the implicit threat. Francis took to making secret supply runs between Flagstaff and Globe, using old hunting trails to avoid Noah's watchful eyes. She had been a scout's daughter before marriage brought her to the gang, and those skills served her well now. During one such journey, she discovered fresh horse tracks leading toward an abandoned silver mine, the kind of remote location perfect for planning something nefarious. Ethan found himself increasingly torn between his responsibilities to the gang and his growing attachment to Clara and the children. He began teaching some of the older orphan boys basic prospecting skills, showing them how to read the mountain signs and test for silver ore. These lessons served as cover for keeping watch over the orphanage, but they also gave him a taste of the legitimate life he'd never known. The tension finally broke one dusty afternoon when Noah confronted Ethan outside the Globe General Store. "You've gone soft," Noah spat, his hand hovering near his pistol. "While you're playing schoolmaster, there's a payroll shipment coming through from Yuma next week. The boys want their cut." The street quickly cleared as townsfolk recognized the deadly current running between the two men. Behind Noah, Alexander and 3 others spread out in a familiar pattern that had served them well in countless robberies. Clara emerged from the store just then, freezing at the sight of the armed men. A small boy clung to her skirts, his eyes wide with fear. The moment crystallized everything Ethan had been wrestling with. The stark choice between the life he'd known and the one he could build. Without taking his eyes off Noah, Ethan spoke clearly enough for all to hear. "The gang's splitting, Noah. You want to keep riding? Fine. But leave Globe and its people out of it. That includes the orphanage." The confrontation drew the attention of Benjamin and Jacob, who materialized on the boardwalk with rifles in hand. Their positioning made their choice clear. They stood with Ethan. The street held its breath as Noah calculated his odds, the hot afternoon sun beating down on them all. Finally, Noah's hand dropped from his gun. "You'll regret this," he promised, backing away. "A man can't change what he is." But as he and his loyal followers mounted up and rode out of town, Ethan noticed that 2 more gang members remained behind, looking thoughtfully between him and the disappearing riders. As the dust settled, Clara approached Ethan, her face a mixture of concern and something deeper. "Those boys you've been teaching," she said quietly, "they need more than just prospecting lessons. They need to see that a man can choose his path, no matter his past." Her words carried the weight of personal experience, and Ethan found himself nodding, understanding that the true silver strike in Globe might not be in the mines at all, but in the chance for redemption they'd all been given. The air crackled with tension as Ethan Mitchell stood at the edge of the mining camp overlooking Globe, his weathered hands gripping the worn leather of his gun belt. The setting sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain, painting the copper-rich hills in shades of blood and gold. Behind him, the remnants of his once feared gang huddled around a campfire, their loyalty now split between their old ways and the promise of redemption that had taken root in their leader's heart. Anna Phillips watched from the window of her orphanage as dust devils danced through Globe's main street. Her past life as a saloon girl seemed distant now, replaced by the responsibility of caring for 12 orphaned children. But the weight of her growing feelings for Ethan, the notorious outlaw who'd been leaving mysterious donations on her doorstep, pressed heavily on her conscience. Benjamin Turner, Ethan's right-hand man for 15 years, paced the worn floorboards of their hideout carved into the mountainside. The sound of pickaxes from the nearby mine echoed through the cavern, a constant reminder of the honest work some gang members had taken up. His loyalty to Ethan warred with his belief that their leader had grown soft, compromised by love. The conflict came to a head when Alexander Roberts, the most volatile member of the gang, burst into the hideout with news that would shatter their fragile peace. "The Phillips Mining Company is moving in," he snarled, throwing a crumpled notice onto the table. "They're buying up every claim in Globe, and that orphanage sits on the richest copper vein in the territory." Helen Turner, Benjamin's wife who'd joined the gang years ago as their cook, watched the growing divide among the men she'd come to consider family. She understood better than most how Anna's influence had awakened something in Ethan that many of them thought long dead. A desire to protect rather than plunder, to build rather than destroy. Frances Roberts, Alexander's sister and the gang's skilled horsewoman, found herself caught between loyalty to her brother and her growing friendship with Anna. She'd seen firsthand how the orphanage had become a beacon of hope in Globe, giving purpose to reformed outlaws who now worked as guards and handymen around the property. The situation exploded when Jacob Perez, a former gang member who'd taken honest work at the mine, discovered that Alexander had been secretly working with the Phillips Mining Company. Their plan was to force Anna and the children out, using violence if necessary, and claim the land for themselves. The revelation sent shockwaves through the gang's already fractured ranks. Noah Mitchell, Ethan's younger brother and the gang's explosives expert, realized the mining company's true intentions went beyond mere land acquisition. They were after an ancient Spanish gold cache, supposedly hidden in the cave system beneath the orphanage. The same caves the gang had used for years to move stolen goods now held the key to both destruction and salvation. Clara Phillips, the mining company's representative and distant cousin to Anna, arrived in Globe with a team of hired guns. Her presence complicated matters further, as she carried documents proving Anna's claim to the land was built on forged papers. A desperate act from her past that could now cost her everything she'd built. The orphanage became a fortress as tensions mounted. Ethan's reformed gang members took up positions alongside the building's legitimate guards, while Benjamin and Alexander's faction watched from the shadows of the surrounding hills. The children inside sensed the coming storm, their young faces pressed against windows as Anna tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. Through a network of old mining tunnels, Frances discovered evidence that Clara Phillips had orchestrated the entire situation, manipulating both the mining company and Alexander's faction. The ancient Spanish gold was real, but its location had been kept secret by Anna's late father, a secret she'd unknowingly inherited along with the property. Ethan found himself facing an impossible choice as the confrontation loomed. The old way would have been simple: gather the gang, raid the mining company's offices, and eliminate the threat. But Anna's influence had awakened his conscience, forcing him to seek a solution that wouldn't perpetuate the cycle of violence that had defined his life. The clash came during a moonless night, as Alexander's faction attempted to torch the orphanage while the children slept. What they didn't expect was the elaborate network of defenses Noah had rigged throughout the property, turning their own tactics against them. The night erupted in controlled explosions and confusion, revealing the true allegiances of every person involved. Benjamin, witnessing Alexander's willingness to harm children, finally understood the magnitude of Ethan's transformation. In the chaos of the attack, he switched sides, using his intimate knowledge of the gang's tactics to help protect the orphanage. His choice sparked a chain reaction among the other hesitant members, tipping the balance in favor of redemption. The final confrontation took place in the maze of tunnels beneath Globe, where Clara Phillips and Alexander found themselves trapped by their own greed. The ancient gold, when finally discovered, proved to be less valuable than the bonds of loyalty and family that had been forged in the crucible of conflict. The true treasure was the transformation of hardened outlaws into protectors, guided by love and the promise of redemption. The tunnels beneath Globe echoed with gunfire as Alexander's remaining loyalists engaged in a desperate last stand. The flickering lantern light cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, transforming the ancient mining passages into an otherworldly battleground. Ethan, now fighting alongside Benjamin to protect what they'd built, navigated the maze with the confidence of a man who'd found his true purpose. Noah's engineering expertise proved invaluable as he used his knowledge of the mine's structural weak points to force Alexander's men into a defensive retreat. The sound of creaking timber supports and falling rocks created an ominous backdrop to the confrontation, while the scent of gunpowder mixed with the musty underground air. Clara Phillips, her once pristine dress now covered in mine dust, clutched a leather satchel containing stolen deeds and banknotes. She had betrayed both sides in her quest for wealth, but now found herself cornered in a dead-end tunnel with Alexander. The former gang leader's face was illuminated by a shaft of light, filtering through a ventilation hole, revealing the desperate madness in his eyes. Helen and Francis had successfully evacuated the children through the secret escape route Ethan had prepared months earlier, guided by Anna's steady presence. The orphans' safety represented everything the reformed outlaws now fought to preserve: innocence, hope, and the chance for a better future. Alice, the youngest of the children, had left behind her cherished rag doll, which lay forgotten in the chaos of the tunnel floor. Benjamin's voice carried through the darkness, offering his former companions one final chance at redemption. Some laid down their weapons, remembering the sense of family they'd once shared. Others, too far gone in their descent into darkness, responded with defiant shots that ricocheted off the stone walls. The decisive moment came when Jacob, who had remained neutral throughout the conflict, emerged from a connecting tunnel with documents proving Alexander's betrayal of the gang years ago. The papers revealed how he had secretly worked with corrupt officials in Prescott, selling out his own men for personal gain while maintaining the facade of loyalty. Ethan confronted Alexander in a narrow passage where crystal formations caught the lamplight like frozen tears. The two men, who had once been as close as brothers, faced each other, their shadows merging on the wall behind them. The weight of their shared history hung heavy in the air, along with the realization that only one path forward remained. Alexander, cornered and desperate, attempted to trigger explosives he'd planted throughout the tunnels, willing to bury everyone alive rather than face defeat. Noah's foresight had led him to discover and disarm most of the charges, but one remote section began to collapse, sending tremors through the entire network of passages. In the ensuing chaos, Clara made a fatal mistake, attempting to flee through an unstable section of the mine. The ceiling gave way, and Benjamin, despite their bitter history, rushed to save her. His act of mercy, even towards someone who had betrayed them, demonstrated how far he had come from his outlaw past. The final confrontation ended not with a gunfight, but with a choice. Alexander, trapped between the advancing reformed outlaws and a collapsed tunnel, faced the consequences of his actions. The gold he had obsessed over lay scattered at his feet, worthless in the face of mortality and redemption. As dust settled in the tunnels beneath Globe, the transformed gang emerged into the sunlight carrying not gold, but something far more valuable: their reclaimed humanity. The orphanage above stood as a testament to the power of change, its windows reflecting the morning light like beacons of hope across the mountainous terrain. The children returned to find their home still standing, protected by those who had once threatened it. Helen and Francis began the task of restoring order, while Anna tended to the wounded with the quiet strength that had first captured Ethan's heart. The land around Globe, scarred by mining and violence, seemed to breathe easier, as if the earth itself approved of the peace that had been won. As dawn broke over the mountains near Globe, Ethan Mitchell stood at the window of Anna's orphanage, watching the first rays of sunlight paint the weathered mining structures in shades of gold. The decision he'd been wrestling with for weeks had finally crystallized in his mind. He would disband the gang, no matter the cost. The love he'd found with Anna had changed him in ways he never expected, showing him a path to redemption he hadn't known existed. Below in the courtyard, children played under the watchful eye of Helen Turner, Anna's most trusted assistant. Their laughter carried up to him, so different from the tense silence that had characterized his life of crime. Through Anna's work with these orphaned children, Ethan had discovered a purpose far greater than the hollow pursuit of riches that had driven him for so long. But Benjamin Roberts, his longtime second-in-command, wasn't going to accept the gang's dissolution quietly. Just yesterday, Benjamin had confronted him outside the Silver Peak mine, warning that if Ethan tried to walk away, there would be consequences. The threat hung heavy in the air between them, decades of loyalty crumbling in an instant. Anna appeared beside him, her quiet strength a balm to his troubled thoughts. "The children ask about you when you're gone," she said softly, touching his arm. "Especially little Noah. He sees you as the father he never had." Her words struck deep, reminding Ethan of his own fatherless childhood in Prescott, of the anger that had driven him to a life of crime. Jacob Phillips and Alexander Perez, the youngest members of his gang, had already approached him about leaving, seeking honest work in the mines. They'd grown up hearing tales of the Mitchell gang's exploits, but the reality had proven far less glamorous than the legends. Ethan saw in them the same weariness he felt, the same yearning for a different life. Frances Roberts, Benjamin's wife, had secretly visited Anna the previous evening, warning that her husband was planning something desperate. Benjamin had always been volatile, but lately his behavior had become increasingly erratic. The discovery of a rich new silver vein in the mountain had him convinced they should stake one final claim, by force if necessary. Clara Phillips, the town doctor's widow who served on the orphanage's board of trustees, had offered to help Ethan establish a legitimate business, a freight company to serve the growing mining operations. Her late husband had left her with considerable influence in Globe, and her support could make the difference between success and failure in his bid for redemption. The sound of approaching horses drew Ethan's attention. Through the dusty glass, he spotted Benjamin riding toward the orphanage with 3 unfamiliar men. His heart sank as he recognized their bearing. Hired guns from Yuma, known for their ruthlessness. Benjamin had made his choice, and now Ethan would have to make his. Anna read the tension in his stance and moved closer. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "remember that love is stronger than hate. These children have taught me that every day." Her words steadied him, as they had so many times before. She had survived her own dark past to build something beautiful, showing him that transformation was possible. As Benjamin and his men dismounted, Ethan touched the gun at his hip, not in anticipation of violence, but as a reminder of what he was leaving behind. He had spent years building his reputation as the most feared outlaw between Flagstaff and Globe. Now he would risk it all to become something else entirely, a protector rather than a predator. The confrontation that followed would be remembered in Globe for generations, though not for the reasons anyone expected. When Benjamin burst into the orphanage, guns drawn, he found not just Ethan waiting for him, but the entire town. Led by Clara Phillips and Frances Roberts, the citizens had gathered to stand with the man who had chosen to change. In the tense silence, it was young Noah who broke the standoff, running to wrap his arms around Ethan's legs. The simple trust in that gesture struck Benjamin harder than any bullet could have. He saw in that moment what Ethan had discovered, that true strength lay not in violence but in the courage to change. The transformation of the Mitchell gang became a story of redemption that echoed through the territory. Jacob and Alexander found purpose in honest work, helping Ethan build his freight company into a success. Benjamin, after a long struggle with his demons, eventually joined them, though the path to his own redemption proved longer and harder. Anna's orphanage flourished, becoming a model for others throughout the territory. The children who grew up there carried forward a legacy not of violence but of hope, proving that even in the hardest hearts, love could take root and grow. Helen Turner would later write that those years marked the true taming of the West, not by force, but by the power of transformation. Years later, Ethan and Anna stood together on the orphanage porch, watching another generation of children play in the yard. The mountains still held their silver, but the real treasure they had discovered lay in the family they had built, not by blood, but by choice. Their story became part of Globe's heritage, a reminder that the frontier's greatest victories were won not with guns, but with hearts brave enough to change. The legacy of Ethan and Anna's transformation rippled through the decades that followed, touching lives far beyond Globe's mountainous borders. Their freight company, now managed by their adopted son Michael, one of Anna's first orphans, became the lifeblood of commerce between Flagstaff and Yuma. The wagons that once carried stolen silver now transported hope in the form of supplies for new schools and orphanages modeled after Anna's vision. Benjamin, in his later years, found an unexpected calling as a mentor to troubled young men who reminded him of his own wayward past. His weathered face and quiet wisdom became a familiar sight at the orphanage, where he taught carpentry and shared carefully edited stories of his life that always ended with lessons about choosing the right path. The scars on his hands, once from gunfights, now came from honest work with wood and nails. Helen Turner's chronicles of Globe's transformation became required reading in Arizona Territory schools. Her detailed accounts of how the notorious Silver Riders became pillars of the community served as testament to the power of redemption. She particularly focused on the children who passed through Anna's care, tracking their successes as they grew into doctors, teachers, and civic leaders. The mining operations that had once tempted desperados now provided legitimate employment for many of the reformed gang members who had followed Ethan's example. Alexander, who had been the gang's explosives expert, put his skills to legal use as a mining engineer, developing safer methods for excavation that saved countless lives. His innovations brought him recognition from mining companies as far away as Prescott. Anna's influence extended beyond the orphanage walls to change how the territory viewed its most vulnerable citizens. The women who had once worked alongside her in less respectable circumstances found new purpose as teachers and caregivers, proving that past circumstances need not dictate future worth. Frances, in particular, established a women's aid society that helped others escape desperate situations. The mountain passes that had once hidden outlaws now served as routes for educational expeditions, with Anna leading groups of her charges into the wilderness to learn about nature and self-reliance. These trips became legendary among the children, who passed down stories of starlit lessons about constellations and morning discussions about desert flowers' survival strategies, metaphors for their own resilience. Ethan's transformation from feared outlaw to respected businessman became a story that merchants told their children, not as a tale of adventure but as proof that character could be rebuilt through honest work and devotion to family. The freight company's reputation for integrity became its greatest asset, worth more than all the silver they had once stolen. In time, Globe grew from a rough mining town into a community that prided itself on second chances. The orphanage expanded to include a school that welcomed all children, regardless of background or circumstance. The mixing of former outlaws' children with merchants' offspring created a new social fabric, stronger for its diverse threads. The annual Founders' Day celebration took on new meaning as the years passed, with the town gathering not to commemorate strikes or shootouts, but to honor the quiet heroes who had rebuilt lives from the ashes of violence. Ethan and Anna's story became intertwined with the town's identity, a reminder that redemption was not just possible, but essential to civilization's advance. As they entered their twilight years, Ethan and Anna watched their extended family grow to include not just their adopted children, but also those who had found their way to better lives through their example. The orphanage's garden, once a simple vegetable plot, bloomed into a sanctuary where desert flowers mingled with imported roses, much like the society they had helped create, where past and present merged into something new and beautiful. Their story didn't end with their passing but lived on in the institutions they built and the lives they touched. The mountain winds still carried whispers of silver dreams, but now they also bore the laughter of children playing in schoolyards and the sounds of commerce conducted with honor. In Globe's cemetery, their headstones stood side by side, bearing the simple epitaph, "They showed us how to change."